Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Q Connector podcast. The summer podcasts are upon us, so we've made a slight tweak to our usual approach for the live podcast. So you'll all be watching this as a recording at some future date. For the summer podcast, probably 2 to 3 over the months of July and August. We're probably going to pre-recorded just because of the availability and everybody's in various modes of travel and summer. Hopefully good content for you all to listen to on the various beaches or pools that you are visiting across the world. And for that, I want to thank again both our guests for supporting in that. So episode 4, again, looking at the data center, cloud, network, and ultimately the AI ecosystem that is sweeping the globe. And for this episode, very excited for those within across the industry for the last 10, 15 years. Probably recognize the name more and more, a very astute member of the ecosystem that does many talks across the world. Mr. Matthew Baynes, thank you for joining us, Matthew, today.
Welcome. Hello.
Let me give a bit of background to save Matthew time, and then he can correct me if I get anything wrong. But Matthew is Vice President of Strategic Partners for the Cloud and Service Provider segment at Schneider Electric. Obviously, for those that hopefully everybody does know, but a huge energy data center infrastructure provider globally. But also Matthew, hence my point around his impact on the industry. He also sits on 2 important boards. One is the European Data Center Association, and the second one, which Matthew, you may touch on in various parts of the responses, actually, which could be interesting, the Net Zero Innovation Hub, which people are probably a little bit less aware of, but does sound very important, obviously, for the topics that we'll be touching on today as well. Of course, Robert, thank you for joining us, our regular guest, founder and CEO of Qarbon, and he'll be providing his thoughts as well. So let's get going. Normal time period for this podcast. We have some pre-prepared questions, which are obviously not live submitted, so all cards on the table, but also shared by people as we discussed this podcast topic. So hopefully all relevant. And as I said, once we're after the summer period, we'll be going back to live podcasts on different time zones as well. We've had a lot of feedback from those in North America, especially. So the next live podcast will be on North America time. So Matthew, Robert, I want to kick us off. Given the companies we're talking about today as well, and the expertise of you both, given your histories, we're obviously going to talk about data centers, but really from an impact perspective, how AI is driving that. And the reason I mention the companies is there's quite a nice synergy here around Schneider's focus and Qarbon Technologies' focus. By that, I mean Schneider is obviously one of the world leaders, if not the world leader, for data center related infrastructure, so to speak. And that's from some hard infrastructure to software infrastructure, but very much enabling the data centers that drive the world and the digital economy. Qarbon, as a lot of you may obviously recall, your regular listeners, but Qarbon Technologies is very much looking at the end user, or the tenant, as it's also sometimes called in the industry, but the customer of the data center. Although Qarbon obviously integrates the data center operators, really the end users, as we talk about them, are the customers of the data center. So hopefully that's quite a nice synergy as well that will come up more and more in the discussion with that. So without further ado, and I know we've got supporting slides for both of you, so I'm ready to bring those up and I'll help guide the discussion today. I want to start with the first question, which is around the impact. We could call it digitization. I'm always apologetic when we now talk about AI because it's the ultimate buzz. But I was just a side note, very happy to hear Bill Gates the other day. So he probably knows a thing or two, saying this can't be another buzz. It's just got too much content and meat to it, and we're just at the start of it. So it's definitely a boom time that's got not just legs but huge transformative impact on multiple industries. But how AI is impacting the capacity and design build out of data centers. And really from that angle, looking at how the sector's changing, and also the new demands being seen as well with that. And I'm going to coach both of you and we can go back and forth. But Matthew, if you want to kick us off with your initial thoughts around that area.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thanks, Omer. And good to be with you here, Robert, today. Just one note. Omer was going to mention it, but I'll mention it instead. You see in the background, we have this football, this foot kicking of football. It's because we have the Euros taking place at the moment. And so I'm a happy man because England got through the other night. And I think Omer, Turkey are playing this evening. So good luck to you on that one.
That's for all the global listeners that, the UEFA European Championship is currently live, and it's a very fetching background as well for Matthew. So it ticks two boxes.
Indeed. I'm based in London, so that's my excuse for that one, by the way. Omer, good question. I mean, Omer, you and I have known each other for a long time. I can't remember how far back, 15 years probably at least. If you go back 20 plus years, and I think this is what Bill Gates was referring to, perhaps maybe, and some people still in this industry recall the times we were building lots and lots of high grade tier 4, some said gold plated data centers in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it was sort of a pay and pray model. And I think the reference there was that didn't go too well for a few years. The bubble burst a little bit and some of the data centers went out of business. So where we're talking about data center construction here, for sure, that bubble is not going to burst as it relates to the demand that's coming from AI. But I think on this conversation, we'll look at AI from two factors here. AI is creating data, and therefore it is creating the need for data centers and data center capacity and construction. The other side of AI is us leveraging AI to optimize the operations, of course. That is collating data, and that sits in a data center for sure. So two sides of the coin there, on a similar topic. In terms of the question around data center capacity, Omer, I've heard also a few people say this is almost a once in a career opportunity here. If you are in the world of data center construction, that is, co-location and data center operation, because the numbers seem pretty phenomenal that we're hearing out of the industry. We've had an incredible wave over the last 6-8 years of cloud computing, enterprises moving their workloads to the cloud infrastructure with the large hyperscalers. And as a result, we've seen a lot of data center construction in primary core markets, from the US moving from west to east, of course. It's been a very healthy run. Data centers have grown from 5-10 megawatts perhaps to 20, 30, 50 megawatts a piece in the core markets. Europe, that would be Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris. In the US, that's West Virginia and a couple of other areas. And you have Singapore, and you've got these core markets where we see a concentration of data center building construction. A lot of that's to do with the network connectivity and the interconnects, of course, historically. Perhaps AI may change that a little bit. We'll see, because there's two sides again to AI. But if we look at the numbers, it's difficult to pinpoint them exactly, but the industry estimated by the end of 2023, there was around 54 gigawatts of data center capacity globally. And as a proportion of that being housed and supporting and underpinning AI, dedicated AI, was about 4 gigawatts. So not a huge percentage. The forecast, again, depends on what you read, because I think there's a slide here, but when I present it, we estimate that by 2028, that 54 will grow to 90 gigawatts. This is a shifting number. We have changed our forecast, should I say, internally about 4 times over the last 12 months in terms of the CAGR, the growth, and the numbers. I was reading a financial report recently. I think it was from JP or maybe in Deutsche Bank. Their estimation was 2023 was 58 gigawatts. So we're there or thereabouts, give or take 4 gigawatts, which is no small number. But their numbers were about 127 gigawatts by the end of 2029. So incredible growth numbers. That's incremental between 40 and 50 gigawatts, however way you want to look at it, over the next 4, 5 or so years of data center capacity, which represents, I don't know, 80% of the data center capacity that we've had in totality that's ever been built. Huge hockey stick effect. And as you can see here, we're sort of estimating that the AI consumption will go from 4 gigawatts, 8% of the market, to around 20% of the market, close to 20 gigawatts. Again, it's difficult to get full accuracy here, but this is what we're estimating. And if you move to 2029 and then 2030 and beyond, the market could be 10x how we see it. So huge demand. It puts huge amounts of pressure on the industry in a number of ways. But in terms of the opportunity, in terms of the demand, in terms of the investment, in terms of the excitement we see in the industry and the stickiness of it, as Bill Gates said earlier, Omer, it's here to stay, and it's going to be an incredible few years ahead of us.
Matthew, you may touch on it, but it's a very interesting progression there. But can you just define the central edge distinction and why this growth in AI makes it such a huge split there? Because I know I think of edge, people may initially think, AI, there's a lot of LLM model training and crunching numbers, and wouldn't that all be done centrally? But here it's almost saying the opposite. Are we reading that correctly, that there's a lot of actual stuff on the edge? But what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think, again, those numbers are, we're predicting them a little bit. We will see how it goes. But if we think about, relate to your question, LLM training, large language models, that's where all the compute is done. That's like the mining, if you like. That's where we're computing billions of parameters of training AI in order to be able to utilize the output of that. The training, the LLM data centers, the dedicated data centers, the AI factories, I think it's been coined in the industry, we will see in probably up to gigawatt size campuses and beyond, depending on the markets and the time frame and how much this grows. We could see gigawatt, 2 gigawatt type campuses where the LLM training parameters will be computed and calculated. Now, the location of those may differ to where we see traditional cloud data centers today, which is in the core markets, the metropolitan areas, the capital cities. These LLM dedicated AI factories, we're starting to see the discussion around them being in areas, if you think about a gigawatt or 2 gigawatts, that's a lot of power. So firstly, there's a huge power constraint on where you can locate these facilities. You can't just drop them into Paris and into Frankfurt because the power just isn't there. And then you think about the cost of power, I think, and sustainability. You definitely want to be highly renewable in what you are deploying. So if I take, again, I'm in Europe, so I'll use that as an example. I know this is global, but you can probably relate this to different parts of the world in different ways. Data center for centralized training is going to go where there's power. The location will be determined by power, not necessarily the connectivity, because latency perhaps is not so critical for the training side of the data center. And so we are seeing, for example, the Nordics being talked about a lot in Europe. There is a lot of renewable energy, a lot of hydro available. Land perhaps is definitely a little bit cheaper than Frankfurt. And I think overall, the cost of energy and the cost of operations will be a lot cheaper when you're talking about this scale of 1 and 2 gigawatts. The edge that we talk about here is the data that's the output gets compressed from the training data, the LLM data centers or the AI compute. The compressed version of that is what gets monetized and utilized by the consumer, let's say, in whatever segment that could be. It could be healthcare, it could be research, it could be corporates using co-pilots or optimized AI operations to run their or optimize their operations, or eventually probably to autonomously run their operations. That's utilizing the AI output, a compressed version at the edge on site. And that's sort of what we're saying is the edge data center. So they will be a mixture of dedicated and probably co-housed with cloud data centers, we suspect. Again, this is all to come. But that will be in more metropolitan areas and will need to be closer to the consumer. And that's where the connectivity discussion comes back into play, and the latency comes back into play a lot more as well for that critical aspect of AI.
Very good. Yeah, that helps set the scene phenomenally. I know there's more, some really interesting content here. Robert, I just want to spin to you a little bit on the similar question, but maybe coming at it from a different angle to Matthew's, obviously, from a design and capacity build, from a platform and operating perspective. I know we'll probably touch on specifically digitization later on, the operations, but just on this thought around the capacity impact coming and what you see as the the impacts on DCs and end users from your perspective.
Yeah, no, happy to chime on in. So we're seeing actually two different changes, stresses for the industry. So as we were talking just now about these large LLM models, they're in remote-ish locations. It's harder to find operations teams. These are locations that you want to automate as much as humanly possible. Not only do you need to find power, you need to find technicians and people to actually work those sites. So where Qarbon comes in is that we actually create that final link between the systems that run that data center to make that data, make those interfaces, make those APIs effectively available to the consumer, the tenant of the data center, so they can orchestrate and they can automate that site as much as possible, because they're not going to have, in many cases, a 24/7 staff, or there'll be different angles that they need to be able to operate, but they still need to have full visibility to those locations. And then we have a different problem set when you get into the center of town, where now for the first time, you may be putting a 30 kilowatt rack into a data center that is well connected, but was never designed for that type of facility. And or maybe an 80 kilowatt liquid cooled rack. These are things that were just these core buildings that are in good locations, have the right connectivity, but were never designed for. And it's highly critical that you understand what's going around and what's happening in the infrastructure outside of your racks. The cases that I like to use, to use the more dramatic fault scenarios, is that if something critical happens within the data center and you can't react fast enough before it begins to impact your edge equipment in that data center, you go down. So having real-time access to the information about how that site is performing, what is going on, what are the maintenance windows, has anything changed in the environment, because your tolerances are way tighter if you have a 30 kilowatt air-cooled rack as opposed to a good old-fashioned telco rack that was 2 kilowatts and sitting in a corner with 2 old routers in it. So the whole dynamic as to how we have to manage these sites has gotten us away from a bunch of people in a NOC responding on a 4-hour SLA are good enough. In many cases, that's just not good enough. That doesn't give you enough time to manage these facilities in the way that you need to. And that's really where I think what Schneider does in being able to optimize and digitize a data center itself dovetails very well with what Qarbon does, is to make that information available in whatever format and whatever API package or web package that the end customer wants to be able to see it and consume it in, so they can make the right decisions in real time to manage their assets the way they need to.
Perfect. And that sort of touches on the synergy we spoke about at the start, Robert, as well, doesn't it? In terms of the, what the companies are trying to do in the industry, I guess, as for the ecosystem. Perfect. I'm going to come back to you, Robert, because I know you've got content around this topic before we go to the next question. But Matthew, I want to come back to your very relevant and pretty cool, I think, slides. So visualize the impact neatly and reference some of the stuff a lot of people, even before you'd have to have been in the data center industry to know about Hopper or the other names. I think you could probably pick quite a few people off the street now who could start speaking to you about NVIDIA and Hopper because it's become so cool and front of mind to everybody. So if you want to speak to these, Matthew, that would be great on the same question and topic.
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 slides just giving some illustration. I think it dovetails brilliantly into what Robert says when you talk about the densification of racks, right? And then the operational criticality of what that looks like. And it does change the game a little bit. This illustration here is a slide from our friends at NVIDIA. Schneider recently announced a partnership with them, I think back in April. We co-presented at a Schneider event. We're looking at co-designing and doing reference designs together, which exactly talks to the topic that you mentioned, Robert, which is how do we deploy high-density AI clusters into data centers that aren't designed to house that type of data center, or that type of density, should I say. This is an illustration of that, and this is the Hopper GPU from NVIDIA. This is showing you a 30 megawatt, let's call it cluster, for want of a better phrase. It could be classed as a lot of clusters here, but let's put it as one. And you can see we have 16,000 Hopper GPUs, 55,000 tokens per second. This is the compute. And you can see sort of the footprint it takes up. It's an illustration of the footprint it takes up. That's all I'm sort of highlighting here. And as some may have known and read the press and whatever, NVIDIA have this new Blackwell GPU coming out. And if you flip to the next slide, I think this very well demonstrates the densification that we're seeing coming from the NVIDIA GPUs. And if you're in this industry, you can imagine the impact that's having on the data center world and the resources, the employees, the designs, and the operations of the data center. This is the same 30 megawatt power cluster, or same cluster to the tune of 30 megawatts in 1/3 of the footprint. This is 14,000, so it's fewer GPUs, it's much more powerful, density is much higher, could be up to 100, 120 kilowatts per rack. And even discussions have been north of that. I was at a conference in Cannes recently where one of the heads of the large hyperscalers in terms of the data center said he's seen a roadmap for some AI research projects to a 1 megawatt rack. Now, we all agree in the industry, although we probably would have said that with a 120 kilowatt rack, but I would say we all agree that we're not going to see that en masse, I wouldn't have thought, and it's very difficult to manage that. But we suspect that we could see en masse 120 kilowatts per rack in multiples of in clusters. Next slide, if you just have a quick look, Omer, this is putting strains on the data center industry. And as you said quite rightly, Robert, we have the full life cycle: design, build, operate, and maintain. The design and build piece of it, there's huge changes that need to happen. I think when we're looking at AI clusters, high density NVIDIA and AI compute, putting that into a data center, or designing a data center, an AI factory for these types of high density clusters. There's the densification of IT systems. I've touched on that. Even when we talk 60, 70 kilowatts a rack, it's already challenging for data center operators, data center designers, and traditional cooling practices to manage that level of heat output and the loop required for that. But we're actually talking 120, 150, and perhaps up to 200 with some of the new technology that's coming. I know NVIDIA they're already working on their next iteration of their GPUs. The second challenge in terms of design and construction is big power. Start talking about, again, that densification per rack. We've got big power to the racks now. This poses some challenges as well in terms of designers, and we need to look at technology, and we need to look at different ways of designing. And part of Schneider's role in this is the innovation side. So we are heavily invested in working with our customers, the hyperscalers, the design firms, the construction firms, on where we can innovate, what gaps there are in the industry, how we're going to be able to support this high power, this high densification coming down the line. And of course, you touched on it, Robert, and Omer, you may have mentioned it earlier. The cooling is one of the biggest challenges of this. And I think data centers today definitely are not designed to handle this type of density. We're starting to look at new cooling technologies. Direct to chip, of course, seems to be the direction of travel for the majority of the industry. We're familiar with immersive and tank systems. Probably they may be a little bit more niche. With the larger data centers, 100, 200, 500 megawatts, up to 1 gigawatts, we're probably more likely in the medium term to see direct to chip. But again, the criticality of that infrastructure becomes ever more so visible and in the spotlight with an organization. So we need to mature here. We need to look at how we design and build data centers. And then coming on to Robert's point, the operation and maintain the end of the life cycle part of the data center, we must look to digitize that. And I think collectively we'll touch on it a little bit later, Schneider and Qarbon, I think there's a good synergy there.
Excellent. Really, really interesting. I think, yeah, those slides jumped out to me, and obviously rightfully so after that update, Matthew. So thank you for that.
Yep.
So what I want to do is just swing back to you, Robert, to dive a little bit more on the automation side in this area, really around some of the builds and capacity impact topics. And then Matthew, you touched on it then. I think without a doubt now we're moving towards the energy side of things. So that's where I want to go next. But just before that, Robert, I know you've got some content, and there's probably quite a few different items there from Matthew's update that you probably want to touch on. So I'm going to pass to you before we move to the next question.
Well, yeah, Omer, if you could throw up my slides, and I just wanted to sort of set the stage for people as to what we see in the market. So if you took a step back and you looked at the global market for data centers, there's roughly 1,000 different data center operators in the world today that people use, but they all tend to operate in different ways because there's no standards right now. There's no unified mechanism by which data is disseminated from this operator community to the tenant community. And just at a very high level, there's about 20 data center operators that have API frameworks. So they have automated and orchestrated ways of disseminating information, but they're all proprietary. They're all specific to that operator. Then you have another 80 plus that really only provide information to their communities via web portals. And then the greater bunch via email and PDF. And that's really the standard for how we do things, not a terribly automated fashion. Omer, if you could jump to the next slide. The way that we see it really is that you have this community of those 1,000 data center operators. In many cases, they themselves are incredibly well organized and operate terribly efficiently with Schneider equipment, let's say. But the way they talk to their customers is through teams of people and systems and swivel chairs. We haven't closed the gap between how we operate the data center and how the tenants operate their pods, their halls, their equipment, their AI clusters within those data centers yet. That's what we're looking to solve. So, Omer, if you could jump to the next slide. At a very high level, we see it as an environment, if you were to break up all of them, that there's all these different mechanisms that end customers don't really care how that data center has chosen to control and disseminate information and provide it to customers. Right now, one of the biggest problems that I see in this AI evolution is that if you need 20 megawatts in a city center and there's no data center that you can find that has the 20 megawatts you need, you might be deploying across 4 different data centers to get the density of the power that you need. And now you have 4 different incredibly diverse operating planes that you need to make look the same, that you're operating this cluster across 4 different platforms as if they were one. That's really the fundamental problem that Qarbon is looking to solve, to take whatever disparate feed is coming out of that data center, homogenize it, and make it available to the end customer. So as we like to put it, Omer, next slide, we take this manual environment and we turn it into something that's available and consumable. The next slide, please, Omer. Into this. So this is really what we're trying to do, is we're taking a look at data centers from a tenant, the customer of data center perspective, and saying, how do they want to consume the capacity within those data centers? And to us, AI is really the best thing that could happen to Qarbon because it's creating stress points all throughout the value chain within the data center community. Data centers, small, large, center city, and remote, are all seeing AI needs hit them in ways that they hadn't planned for before. And what used to be good with a 4-hour or 8-hour response time, or email could be sent, or text or pages, that's just not good enough anymore for people to be able to operate and monitor these clusters. If you built a data center around the idea of 8 kilowatt racks as a max, and now 30, 40 is going on in, you are at a tight window where anything small that happens within that site can cause you to have a disruption in your facility. And that's just not acceptable in most of these applications. So at a very high level, that's how we see it. And that's how we see it really coming together from an operator of AI infrastructure in these markets with what's available and how it needs to play out. So Thank you. Long-winded answer, but I think I touched on how we see it from our standpoint.
No, really useful. And I think, again, it reiterates that the impact for the ecosystem is on both sides, right? It's the infrastructure, which is the operators, and then it's everybody in there that's from the NVIDIAs right to the end using corporates and those companies. To Matthew's point at the start, that will disseminate the LLMs to everybody eventually. Ending with the AI avatar that eventually sitting at our desk or sitting beside us as a hologram. It's all going to be driving this use. So no, really, really helpful positioning, Robert. So I'm going to move because time is creeping, and I want to make sure we don't miss out any of the questions. So we're going to move to energy now. Matthew, you summed it up at the start for a very helpful macro position of where it's going. But I'd like to delve a little bit deeper, and obviously, Matthew, you'll guide us really here. But Robert, very interested from your perspective on a BMS and data perspective of the energy situation from the end user. But Matthew, I know you've got content as well. But if I could ask your help in setting the scene for us again, for our listeners around the energy situation, and by that I really mean two things. One is there's a lot of stats thrown around online and more prominent comments around the problem that is upon us, and then you sometimes have alternative views, and I'm referencing Bill Gates a lot today, but not a bad person to reference. But he also said that we should weather that, or we should temper it. That's the better word. That there is a lot of talk, but hang on, let's see. It's really maybe we're ballooning it a little bit, and it's going to happen in increments. So I think, Matthew, you're very well positioned to help us on that question. So your initial thoughts.
I will do my best. Depending on who you talk to, what you read, I think, and if I take a step back. During COVID, there was a big spike in data center demand and construction. People working from home, using digital tools, Microsoft Teams. And I think all of a sudden, data centers got on the radar of national governments as well. And it shifted more towards a critical infrastructure of national interest. So this is one change that's happened as well with the data center industry. Then if you start looking about the energy usage, some people say data centers, again, 54 gigawatts, what is that in terms of the global energy demand? Not 100% sure. Some people say it's around 2% data centers consume. I read an article recently that said it could go to 20%. And I think Bill Gates is right to say we should temper it, because 20% is huge percentage of the global energy demand. If some people are saying that's what data centers are going to consume, it's going to raise red flags around the world to lots of different types of people, governments, activists, whomever you can imagine. With power comes the need for land as well, of course, and as we've seen in places like Amsterdam, and there's been some challenges around data centers. There's been some protests from farm, perhaps we should start to make them. But in any case, it's going to grow from, let's say, the estimated 2% today. And as we talked about earlier, power is the number one challenge that we have today with deploying data centers to support and underpin the demand of AI, LLM. If you're a data center operator, trying to find the required amount of power is very, very difficult. And so it is top of mind for data center operators. And in the background, we need to think about how we interact with the community, how we interact socially, and how we portray what data centers are and what they're doing, and the contribution to society. I saw a very interesting post actually from the general manager of AWS Europe, Tanuja Randri, where she talked about the contribution that they are bringing to society. It was actually one country, due to the 3 billion or so investment that they're putting in data centers in that country. We need to do more of this. However, if you go to, and we talked about these two types here, if you go to the next slide, Omer, again, the LLM, if they're more centralized data centers, then if we can position them in places next to a hydro plant, then the power challenge is not so difficult, of course. That's probably what hyperscalers and everyone who's deploying the large AI on scale are looking at. They're looking at where they can deploy with quick access to renewable and reasonably priced energy. Where you can't do that, we have power problems. And I think some of these here are some of the solutions that operators are looking at. Peaker plants, for example, these are maybe they're at the national grid. They're plants that can be ramped up to support an overload, a peak of power demand. You know, it's a good measure, but it's not really the measure for the type of AI demand that we're talking about in some of the metropolitan cities. We've seen grid storage, so the national grid actually putting energy storage in and then selling that obviously at times of peak times for power outages and or power demand or peak demand. On-site storage, so that's the grid side of things. Then we move into the operator side of things, and we see some operators looking at on-site storage. I'll come to sort of the point here, which is this is a hybrid discussion, I think, is the point we're looking at here. Hybrid energy is the way we're going. And the next point is how we manage that. But on-site storage could be a solution. But then, you know, we talk to people about that. And again, if you're talking 50 megawatts, 100, 200, 300 megawatts, that is a lot of on-site storage if you're using it through utilization of batteries. That's a big footprint. That's a lot of batteries. And we scroll down the list to maybe on-site power, and we see on-site generation, gas generation, turbines, perhaps solar. There's a lot we can look at, and a lot of the hyperscalers are signing up PPA contracts where multi-gigawatt solar farms are being built, funded by one of the hyperscalers, for example, and that helps with their offsetting and their general management of their carbon. And as we move forward, the industry is talking about hydrogen and small modular reactors. I think hydrogen personally would be a great solution if we can get it right for the medium to long term. And I think ultimately nuclear is what people are thinking, what people are looking at. You talked about the Net Zero Innovation Hub, or you mentioned it earlier, Omer. I'm on the Net Zero Innovation Hub, the board of that. A colleague next to me is from Microsoft. In his job title, he has nuclear. So this is a gentleman working for a software firm who has nuclear in his title. So I think it's obvious that the likes of Microsoft see the huge demand and growth in AI, the challenges with power, and what solutions they can look at, they can turn to, let's say, in the long term. Probably 10 years away for that. Obviously, the country you go in has to have a mandate or a policy around nuclear. Microsoft, I'm sure, won't go into countries that don't have nuclear and say we want nuclear. That won't work. But there's lots of things we're looking at, the industry's looking at. I think in the short to medium term, we'll probably have a hybrid solution of mixed energy sources. And again, Robert, that comes down to, or that points to a challenge of how we manage that hybrid energy. One thing we probably will see is a closer relationship with the DNOs, with the energy providers, and probably as well, if the data centers can shift to be a more active asset on the grid, where there's a bit of back and forth, there's a bit of sharing and utilization of excess energy or energy outside of peak demands, and feeding back to the grid, perhaps, then I think the view of a data center will be a lot more favorable, and perhaps we can start to work towards a common goal and achieving what we're trying to do with the AI demand.
And if I can jump on in real quick here, what we're seeing from the tenant side, from the consumption side, is that especially in the fintech space and in the cloud service provider space, they want access to that information in near real time. The whole idea of understanding what your energy consumption is in a site with a report that you get once a month that can't be validated in real time just isn't good enough anymore. They want to understand what the real consumption is, how much is green, how much is not so green, and be part of those discussions to say, yeah, if I go a little more green, what does that mean to not only my bill, but the overall environment, can I even go? Everyone wants to go more green, but sometimes it's not free. It's not reasonable, or there are some gives and takes. So there's a large partnership that you're going to start to see, or I think we're going to start to see, as the consumption layer, the tenant perspective starts to get access to more information, that they can be part of those discussions. And maybe as some silly things that were suggested almost, is that you could move workloads. Is there a problem in a location if you're involving now the tenant? Let's say it's a large financial company that is doing all of their LLM models in a certain location, and there is a power issue to be had. Could they move it? If they are part of that, if they're seeing what's happening in real time, that may be a very viable situation, that they could move that load for a period of time and alleviate that just from a consumption standpoint. But for those things to be real, there needs to be real-time interaction, not only collection of this information, but dissemination up the value chain to the consumer, to the tenant, so that they know and they are part of that discussion. And that's really what Qarbon is trying to do, not only in the current environments that we see now with energy and water consumption, but also exacerbated by AI that you see here. We're looking to make it so that the people who are running those clusters, running those models, can be part of those interactive conversations as to what power is being consumed, how it's being used, and how the mix could be altered if there's a need, or if it's beneficial for all parties. So from our standpoint, that's where I see things going. Sorry,
Matthew, did you want to make?
No, I completely agree with it. I think we'll touch on it in a little bit if we have enough time. But that the digitization of the data center operation and the digitized view that you get, we're totally lockstep with you on that, Robert. Schneider's very well invested in that. In fact, you would have seen a lot of our more recent acquisitions over the last half a dozen years, let's say, has been less in the hardware manufacturing side of our traditional business and more on the software side. And that is around software management platforms across the whole life cycle of the data center, to exactly give that data, that visibility and that view to the operators, and ultimately, Robert, to the likes of you and the tenants, who can be more smart with that data. They can manage it better. They contribute to their overall CSR, sustainability, or any legislation that's coming, and can offset some of the high costs of electricity in one location versus another. So very good point.
Yep.
And I'm gonna come back to you, Matthew, on that, because I know you've got some great overview content. But Robert, if you want to, I'm just sharing on the screen as well, for the listeners' benefit, the Qarbon approach. But exactly to Matthew's point, it's sort of, and probably before the last question, actually, unfortunately, given time. But this idea of the automation of the DC and the digitization of the whole ecosystem, because of everything we've spoken up to this point, and that collection of real-time monitoring, and then the analytics of the data, I think it's going to tie nicely into what Matthew's going to touch on from the energy component. But just if you want to dig in a bit more onto the digitization angle and what you see from an industry perspective as well.
Well, yeah, just at a very high level, and just to touch on this slide here with regard to AI, but from a different angle, how you use AI in your environments to manage your cloud, your infrastructure environments in data centers, as well as your AI environments that you've deployed. So one of the things that Qarbon sees as being a key area that we can play is if you are deploying infrastructure across multiple data centers, some running Schneider on the back end, and heaven forbid, they may other data centers that may not be, but you want to still have a consistent view that sits on top, so you can be able to make decisions. And in this case, see how much better the Schneider run site is operating than its competitor, which of course is what we'd see. But we see Qarbon as being sort of that neutral play that can then collect the data, homogenize the data, and for the first time, really give you a way to compare and contrast and really look at the data holistically, and then make decisions across your entire estate. And as we like to put it, you can actually now look at and operate clusters, even though they're in different data centers, as if they were one autonomous unit, which is really where I think a lot of the AI near-term needs are going to go, because people just aren't going to find all the space, all the power they want in a single given location. There's just too much demand for the supply that exists. We're going to see that 20 megawatt site split across 4 or 5 different locations with different operating processes and different monitoring systems. So to us, that's how we see us from an AI perspective, play in. Omer, if you could flip back to the previous slide, just to show how we're tactically doing that. So what Qarbon is doing is we are creating a standard set of API packages for everything that a tenant does with a data center. As many of you know from the previous podcast we did, we're working with the MEF standards body. So we will be creating standardized APIs for how a tenant will interact with their data center infrastructure. Right now, every data center is proprietary. Some good, some not so good, but all different regardless of how. So it's your classic case. If you have 20 people in a room all singing in different languages, you have noise. If they're all singing in tune in one, it's an opera. So we're trying to create that experience for the end customers that really ties it all together so that they can begin operating their estates regardless of to what the underlying facility is. So at a high level, that's how we're looking to solve it from a consumption standpoint. Thank you, Omer.
Really useful, and again ties in really nicely. And Matthew, thank you for teeing us up with that with that question. I'm going to come back to you on that as we approach what will be, unfortunately, my last question of the podcast. But I know, Matthew, you've got some good content specifically on that digitization point as well. So I wanted to make sure we did have time to cover those.
Yeah, look, let's see what we can squeeze in, Omer, but I'll be succinct if as possible. This is an illustration. I think we all tend to agree. Actually, when we look at data centers, this is a building, but it could be a data center, right? Just as easily. The operational efficiency is the critical piece of the jigsaw. We can design great data centers. We can design on paper, and of course, sustainability needs to run through everything that we do today. So we can design great data centers, we can build them, great, we hand over the keys. Once we go into the operation, that is the key. How we optimize those operations from handover after commissioning to the end of life, whenever that is, which we don't know necessarily. That differs, and we want to try and sweat these assets. We certainly want to make sure there's no stranded capacity. We want to make sure that we're optimizing everything that we can do within that data center. This is really just saying, and actually I saw some statistics that said we have an energy crisis. Actually, I think someone said about 70% of wasted energy around the world sits in inefficient buildings. Data centers is in that bucket, of course, but I do think data centers are a little bit ahead of the curve because inefficiency hits the bottom line massively if you are a co-location provider, for example, because a data center is your business. If it's an enterprise data center, it's a little bit different. It's more of an enabler. But certainly there are efficiency gains that can be made through the life cycle of a data center. And if you go to the next one, I think this is sort of what I'm trying to highlight here. And I mentioned earlier, a lot of the acquisitions that Schneider have made recently have been in that software world, the building management world, the data center lifecycle world, from design, build, operate, and maintain. We're not a designer ourselves, but and we don't operate data centers ourselves. We're not an FM provider. What we do is offer tools from the design through to the maintain and everything in between that our customers across the whole ecosystem can use. This could be a design firm, this could be a construction firm, this could be a co-location operator, it could be a hyperscaler, and then giving visibility, digitizing all of that data, lifting it up a layer into some advisor platforms, and then the user, the tenant, whoever, yourselves, Qarbon, of course, as well, utilizing that data to make decisions around their business and around their operations, around optimizing, whether that is around cost, that is around efficiency, that is around sustainability, or it is around managing your loads across multiple assets and real estates. We do the same, in fact, if you look at the data center as a real estate asset and you have multiple data centers, multiple countries and multiple regions around the world. Again, an operator wants to bring that into a centralized platform and bring efficiency to the views that they get there. So from the physical infrastructure layer, the M&E layer, we do that with some of these platform layers, but you can see some of the ones that we've acquired over the years and where they sit in the full life cycle of the operations. And just in summary, that does give and is intended to give that digital visibility of your operations, potentially and hopefully through a single pane of glass. That's ultimately, I think, what customers want. A lot of our softwares are open API, so they're vendor agnostic. It's not only suitable for Schneider products, Schneider hardware on site, so we can actually plug into whatever you have on site with these softwares that we have. So yeah, fully on board, Robert. The digitization of data center operations is critical. It's the journey I think everybody's going on, and it is the way that we're going to be able to operate in remote areas where we might have lights out or dark sites, and how we can meet our sustainability goals. And in some regions, legislation and regulations that are coming and being forced upon the industry, we have to have that visibility and that data so we can report back.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We're in lockstep there. That's exactly what the tenants want to see as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Perfect. So I'm conscious of time, so this will be the last question. And given we've got a very nice prepared summary from Matthew, I'm going to come to you first with it, and then Robert, you're going to have the last say by the looks of the time. But definitely we can come back to you, Matthew, as needed. So the question is around a bit of a crystal ball future view. It's the year 2030. Which will be upon us much quicker than many of us may like. What does the data center industry look like? AI has obviously probably encapsulated all corners of the globe by then, I'd imagine. There's even more automation, more predictive support for daily lives. Every industry, I'd imagine, is using it. And maybe even more extreme developments that we're struggling to think about now, given the speed of technology's growth. But tied to that, Matthew, with everything you know, and Robert, I'm going to come to you on this as well. What do you think it looks like in the year 2030, both from a perspective of what you think it should look like, and maybe what you think may or may not happen, given just how things develop and speed?
Good. Well, I mean, it is a crystal ball. It's a difficult one, but we'll have a stab for sure. And I think we have to, as Schneider, we have to, because you think about the R&D program that someone like Schneider has to put in place. We have to look 5, 6, 7 years ahead. We do our best with that. We do, and the way we do that is we talk regularly and frequently with our customers who are designing and building data centers and operating data centers, for that matter. We gain their feedback, and then we push that into our product development, our R&D labs, and we come up hopefully with solutions that meet the demands of the data center going forward. We do this every year, so we have this recurring R&D voice of customer, let's say life cycle, if you like. 2030 is a bit tricky, but these are some of the things I think we're looking towards. You could put some of these on the left, the challenges they're facing today, and I think they are facing them today, but they're only going to get even more challenging. If you, again, I do apologize, but I'm sitting here in Europe and I'm on the board of the EU DCA, and the regulation that's coming is around climate neutral data centers. So by 2030, data centers above 500 kilowatts need to be climate neutral. What does that mean? The EU DCA is working with the European Commission to figure out exactly what that means and looks like, so we can have some input into what that legislation looks like. But needless to say, the EU is doing this. Other regions are going to be doing the same, I'm sure. It may take a little bit longer. And then you have a body like the iMasons, who has the iMasons Climate Accord, who are looking at a similar topic on more of a global basis. So I do think there are regulations that are coming that are going to force us to do lots of things. Outside of that, I think as a business, as an industry, we need to look at what we can do better. For all of the reasons that we've talked about today. Obviously on the left, switch to green, we talked about sustainability. That's a must. Everybody is doing that, whether you are an enterprise organization, whether you are Microsoft, Amazon and Google, they've made some very, very bold pledges around this. So We need to make sure as an industry we help them get through that. Scale at speed. Naturally, speed is of the essence. It is the number one currency of the business at the moment. If you can get power, is speed to market. And then increased flexibility. I think we talked about the densities, we talked about the new architectures, the new IT, the rapid pace of IT evolution. Moore's law seems to be a little bit out of the window at the moment. And if that's going to continue, we need to design data centers that can bring flexibility. On the right, so how do we do that? Well, we're probably going to see some form of converged energy systems. We talked a little bit about that. We're going to see energy, hybrid energy and systems come together to really build towards that net zero emissions solution. So that's sort of a no carbon ambition that I think the industry has. And I think by 2030, will we get there? Let's see. Some of the pledges lead to that. But one of the challenges that may delay that is the co-location operator doesn't always get the flexibility to innovate as much as they would like, because some of the tenants don't allow them to do that because they're very hell-bent on the SLAs that they give and more strict on what they're able to do in terms of the innovation. So we need to unlock that a little bit. So the hyperscaler self-build and the co-location operator data centers can move at the same speed in terms of innovation. Digital lifecycle, we talked about that. We need to unlock the power. We need to unlock the power of digitized assets and tools to really support the one above it in terms of no carbon for sure, and efficiencies of operations. And I think I put on here fewer people. Look, data centers, we talked about activists earlier. We don't want them to be empty shells. We do want to create jobs in this industry. AI will be creating jobs for sure, but the actual data center, we still want to have some jobs there, but maybe fewer people. Some people say no people, full digitization, full AI, full robotics and automation. I think we're heading towards partially getting there. By 2030, I'm not sure. And then adaptive infrastructure. We've got to be prepared to give that flexibility. How can we implement new technologies, more advanced technologies that are coming in the next few years, and then be more efficient with the resources that we're using in that data center, whether that's power, whether that's water. Again, a lot of visibility, a lot of eyes are on us. So we want to make sure we don't waste any of what we're consuming within that package, that letter of the envelope, sorry, of the data center infrastructure. So a few things there I think we're heading towards. A few people in industry might be retired because it's going to be a very fun, exciting journey. A lot of investment, a lot of build, a lot of money spent. And I think we're here for the ride. I'm excited.
Excellent. And I think really nice, especially the two there, Robert, as I pass to you for the same question, the digital life cycle, obviously, that Matthew referenced, and the adaptive infrastructure is exactly to the carbon message. So handing over to you on that perspective.
Certainly. So the term we use internally to Qarbon to refer to this, or where we're headed, is really what we call is the software programmable data center. So we see this as a fully automated environment. It doesn't mean people go away, but there's people only where needed, where you don't have this layer of humanity that gets in between your operation support systems and your data center infrastructure, which is the world we're in today. So we see a world in the next 5 to 6 years where all of that is automated, where only when the fallout happens, when something that doesn't fit, that's when the human beings get involved. But you're able to monitor and maintain all of your energy and your water consumption, make changes to that in real time, as we spoke about earlier. Is there a need that would cause you to spin down or spin up? We'll see that networking switch away from sort of this dedicated hardware environment with very specific proprietary needs to more of a white box environment, real highly dense, maybe even GPU-based networking, where now software routing, switching, et cetera, is code. It isn't something that's dedicated hardware in any shape or form. It looks like another AI function. And that's what's really driving a lot of the demand potential anyway, as we see it. So it's really this whole advent of a data center that really becomes this fully orchestratable environment, an atomic unit in and of itself that, again, a software programmable data center where you're able to write to it and tell it what to do, and it executes those commands around the infrastructure that you've deployed, where there isn't any gaps in that. And honestly, if you need to report or there's a regulation change, that's a push of a button. or even better, an automatic function that gets done by your AI-driven support system, where that isn't a bunch of spreadsheets with a highlighter that you're going through at the end of the day. That's where we see ourselves in the next 5 to 6 years. And that's sort of the internal phrase, software programmable data center, that we coined to reflect how we see us migrating to that end state.
We're in sync, Robert. Very good.
Well, that's always a nice comment to end on, to be in on sync and in sync, which I think is a nice summary. We sort of went full loop. We talked about the synergies, and we ended with the thought of being in sync. We're at the hour, even though it's the summer recorded podcast. I want to keep to the time, and obviously people watching the recording will appreciate that. Matthew, any parting comments, just to say thank you again for your time and within your busy schedule? Any parting comments or thoughts you want to leave the listeners with?
Thank you, Omer, by the way, and Qarbon, for this invitation. Good to speak to you, Robert, and a pleasure. I've enjoyed it very much. Passing comments, I think from my lens, I would say probably a couple of things. The entire ecosystem, I think, it's ever more critical that they work together, closely together. We need to come together as an industry for two reasons: to execute what we need to execute. We need to be in lockstep, as we've talked about a little bit, Robert, from design, from construction, from the IT side of things, so the white space, the management, the operational layer, the customers, the operators. It sounds a lot, but I think we can do that. And I do see the industry becoming a lot closer together as we speak. It's going to be an exciting 5, 8, 10 years ahead. We need to be able to rely on each other, count on each other. And I think Schneider's here to support this industry. We're here to work with our partners and our customers alike, and we look forward to the journey ahead with you.
Robert?
Oh, yes. Thank you for the time, Matthew. This has been great. Wonderful insights. So I've actually learned a lot here about where we're headed and what the market's really going to look like. And it's great to see that we're fully in sync. Qarbon and Schneider understand where the market needs to go, and we're both marching towards it in slightly different ways, but very much with the same direction in mind. And that's always good to see, because if everyone is marching into the same end goal, we have a better shot of getting there. So thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Great parting point. And Matthew, just to leave, let's hope for success in the football for the mutual nations.
Good luck to Turkey this evening.
And good luck at England-Turkey final, or semi-final at least. There you go.
Perfect. You're hosting at your house, I guess, Omer. I'll see you there.
I'll meet you here. Well, thank you, gentlemen, again, and thank you everyone for listening. Keep a lookout. There'll be at least another 1 to 2 new installments over the summer that you can expect to appear on your feed and on YouTube and on our channel. And keep an eye out for our communications, because we'll then be diving back into the usual regime, probably from September into the live broadcast. And Matthew, we'd love to welcome you back in the future as well, because that's been very, very insightful, as always, from Robert, and you really gave some great information there, which I knew we'd get. So very much appreciated.
It's a date. No problem.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good
Thank
day.
you. Bye-bye.